Hey kiddos, today we're going to be learning about London in the 1600s. At this point in our story, Squanto is going to London with Charles Robbins, and it was in the 1600s. Now, if you visited London today, it would look slightly different. So let's see it through the eyes of what Squanto would have seen in the 1600s. During that time, there was a king in England, and his name was James I. James I was a ruler for 22 years, so he was a king for 22 years. Notice that this is in a painting. This would have not been a portrait because at the time there were no cameras, so anytime you wanted a picture of yourself, it would have had to been done as a painting. Well, Squanto is going to England. England is the orange part. England is known as the country, where he was visiting London, which is the city. So London is a city and the country of England. This would have been what London would have looked like during that time. Notice that it is a sketch with a pencil of what the town would have looked like. London was a harbor city, meaning that boats would come there often to trade and to bring things with them. Notice, too, it's very much an urban area. It's very crowded. The buildings are very close together. So that would be London, England. This is another picture of London during the 1600s. Notice that there's a lot of people walking. There's horses and carriages. There's no cars because in the 1600s, cars did not exist. So this is what it would look like. Notice how the buildings are all super close together. That would be super different than what Squanto is used to. Remember, Squanto lived in a place that had 10 wigwams. He lived in a place that had a cornfield beside each wigwam. So going to a place like this would be completely different than what he's used to and what he's grown up in his entire life. This is typical dress of what a man would wear. So remember, Squanto's coming from a place where they wore animal skins. They got all of their clothing from animals, and this is what the men would typically wear. They would have been dressed from head to toe. The men would have worn beards, and they would have sometimes worn these more fancier outfits. This is what a typical, more wealthier woman would have worn back then. Notice the dresses are very elaborate and just absolutely stunning. Ladies, you would have not worn pants back in the 1600s. You would have been a young lady who would have worn a dress all the time. And so that's kind of what the women would have worn at those times. And it wasn't super comfortable. It was hard to wear at the time. Right here is a typical house that kind of is what it's going to be like for Squanto when he stays in London. This is what the houses would look like. Made a lot of stonework. Their heat would have come from fireplaces. So if you notice here are these stacks. In this particular house, there was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fireplaces. But remember, that's their source of heat in the 1600s. There would have been no electricity. So for electricity, they would have had to use candles at the time. And also the light from the fireplaces. So this is, if you imagine where Squanto will be staying during this chapter, I would imagine a house similar to this one. This is a picture of the boat that Squanto would have been traveling on from America to London. Now, obviously, this is not the exact boat that he would have been traveling on because this is an actual portrait. So this would be similar to what he would have been experiencing when he was going to London. Next, we are going to talk about mutton and plum jam. Mutton and plum jam. Now, you might know what jam is, but you might not know what mutton is. Mutton is lamb meat. Okay, so when you see that word mutton, it is lamb meat, and this is what it would have looked like, typical back then and prepared. They would have ate it still on the bone, and if you've ever had lamb, it's actually a pretty good meat. It's very soft and tender, and so that is what mutton would look like. Now, plum jam is made from plums. That's why it's called plum jam. Plums are an orange, or not an orange, a purple fruit, and it's kind of like a jelly. So this is what plum jam looks like. So for one of his meals, he will eat mutton and plum jam. In this chapter, it's also going to be talking about nightshirts. Well, what are nightshirts? Nightshirts are what men slept in. So this is the typical wear of pajamas for a boy, which is kind of not what we're used to here. So this is what they would have worn. They noticed they wore a cap to bed, which is kind of silly. And they also wore these really long nightshirts. So if you were a kid growing up in the 1600s, particularly a boy, this is what you would have worn for bed during the 1600s. All right, kiddos, I hope you enjoy reading this next chapter in Squanto.